Edwina Currie, welcome to Chat Politics. Do Northerners really die of ignorance and chips?
It's certainly true that Northerners die younger than people down south. And for example, diseases like cancer and heart disease and strokes are much more prevalent here. Most of which, certainly the medics tell me and the scientists tell me, are linked to lifestyle. So there's more smoking up here. There's more obesity, and unfortunately that does result in more heart disease and more strokes. When you challenge people, they think you're being rude. But in fact, all you're trying to do is give them some information on which they can then make an informed choice about whether they're going to stuff themselves with rubbish and smoke and perhaps also drink a bit too much. I hate the idea that people are left in ignorance and patronised by governments. I think they ought to be given the information in as palatable a way as possible and then encouraged, wherever possible, to make the right decision.
You've often said you've indulged in 3 separate careers, those of politics, writing and broadcasting. Which one have you found the most challenging?
Of politics, writing and broadcasting, for me personally, writing has been enormously enjoyable. And because I was lucky enough to have a #1 bestseller and have books in the best-selling lists, it helped pay for the pension fund. When I was in the political world under Margaret Thatcher, the salary wasn't that much. The pension was certainly nothing to write home about. It is these days, but not under Margaret. And on the other hand, the achievement level was pretty high. We could do things. We brought in breast cancer screening. We brought in the MMR, we brought in cervical cancer screening, we had the first campaign on HIV/AIDS in Britain, which I think people took very seriously, and I'm certain we saved a lot of lives as a result of that, especially when you compare with other countries like in South Africa, where still people are dying in very large numbers. So you could achieve something in politics, but it wasn't going to make you rich. When it comes to broadcasting, you can say what you like, it's wonderful. You don't have to modify your opinion to be on message or anything like that. And I've certainly enjoyed, particularly doing radio, where you get an extended discussion. I still do a lot. I do a lot of work with Stephen Nolan on 5 Live at the weekends. The TV stuff, all the reality stuff is just a bit of fun. I like a challenge. Yes. I like doing something I've never done before. I like learning new things. Yeah.
Despite the controversy surrounding your remarks about salmonella in eggs, there was, it turned out, indeed a cover-up. Do you think that perhaps some issues today, some big political issues today, are being covered up? And if so, what are they and when will they be revealed?
Well, 25 years ago, I was, amongst other things, Minister for Public Health. And we were very concerned because people were ending up in large numbers in hospitals. We were getting about 500 confirmed cases of food poisoning a week, most of which was being caused by salmonella in eggs. It was a new bug. And what you all didn't know was, in fact, people were dying as a result. We had about 60 deaths that year. If I hadn't said anything, it would simply have got worse and more people would have died. And sooner or later, someone would have pointed the finger at me. So I thought the best thing to do was warn everybody. And I was disappointed at the government's reaction, which was to say there isn't a problem.
Were you not initially backed, though, by Margaret Thatcher and I think the Health Secretary then, was it Ken Clarke? Were you not initially supported by them?
Well, yes and no. When the press asked Margaret what she had for breakfast and she said scrambled eggs, I thought, right, that's me done. Her opinion was that we shouldn't damage the farming industry. But that seemed to me a mistake, because if some farmers were doing bad practice, feeding the chickens ground up chicken, diseased chicken remains, a horrible thought. But much in the same way that BSE was caught a few years later, then that was a practice that should be stopped. It's the job of government to set some standards. and thereby to protect the public who are not in a position to decide these things for themselves. When it comes to your question about does anything like that happen today, in terms of food safety, I think retailers are much more on the ball than they ever used to be. There's a food standards agency. The horse meat scandal, for example, recently shows that I think people are much more on the ball and that bad practice, I think, can be caught much more quickly, and the public are more aware, more knowledgeable altogether, more savvy. On other issues, could there be a government scandal right now that nobody knows about that'll come out? Oh, for sure, there always is.
We mentioned a moment ago your best-selling books. Did you speak to John Major before you published those diaries? Did you mention that those were going to be sort of released and everything in them? How did that all come about?
Well, more significant in a way was the novel that I published, my first book in of fiction, called
indeed.
A Parliamentary Affair.
That's it.
Which
features heavily actually in your diaries as well.
Well, all sorts of people feature heavily in the diaries, and the novel was the first to lift the lid off some of the goings on in Westminster in a very, very macho world in which women were regarded as, well, it was a bit UKIP-ish in some ways. We are talking about 20 years ago. Women were supposed to be cleaning behind the fridge and gays were supposed to stay in the closet, that sort of thing. A world in which I felt we had to improve. And so the novel was big stuff, and everybody knew I was writing a novel, and they came and told me all their funny stories.
And John Major knew? You spoke to him one to one before?
Of course John knew. And in fact, I gave him an advance copy of the novel and got a message back saying, Norm was reading it in bed and laughing. Well, there you go. The diaries were a different matter. I kept those the moment I realised from 1987 that we were in extraordinary times, that Margaret Thatcher was a revolutionary leader and that the country was being changed and hopefully would not change back. So I kept a note thinking at some point I might write a history of it. When eventually I dug them out many years later, by this time we're into 2002, I showed them to my publisher and he just said, they're good as they stand, just publish them like this. Then you have to take a decision. Do you remove all the interesting bits? Do you censor your own stuff? Or do you think, do you know what? I have a duty to put the record straight on some issues.
How hard did you think about that? Or did you just know instinctively that actually, let's get this whole thing out there?
I was not a happy bunny because at that stage there was so much whitewashing going on as to what had happened in the last Tory government, the 92 to 97 government, and the feeling that everything that went wrong was all somebody else's fault. Even BSE would blame someone else. But the whole point about government is that you're in power. You have responsibility, you have duty, and your duty is not to yourself or to protect your image. Your duty is to the people who sent you there. To me, there's no point in even getting involved in politics otherwise. And I felt quite strongly right through those years, as comes out in the diaries, that we were trying to project an image which was not accurate, and it was wrong to do that. And particularly 92 to 97, the idea that John Major lost the election almost by accident was simply not true. Back to basics, which started to undermine the government, was his idea and was sold in such a way that it really annoyed people with non-traditional lifestyles who started to feel that the Tories hated everybody but themselves.
Did he speak to you after that election and give you his true feelings on the result? Because, of course, he was quite restrained and reserved afterwards, almost in every interview I've certainly seen of him.
In 97, I stood for my own seat and knew that we would lose, because one of the nice things about South Derbyshire is the voters wouldn't lie to you. And they'd say, I'm sorry, Mrs. Currie, I can't vote for your lot. An absolute shambles. Nothing personal, you understand, which is very kind of them, but no consolation. And after that, I knew I was going to have to earn my living doing something else. I'd got my writing already started. and I started working for the BBC. So I moved very quickly
that was the
away
transition,
from being in Parliament. So the answer to your question is no, I didn't have a conversation with John about it. With one or two other people who are close friends, yes.
What did you yourself then think of Blair at the time? Because he changed politics pretty profoundly. Did you have sort of any inclination that he would be that effective?
Well, Blair was a chameleon, and I think that became apparent soon after they won the election in 97. Before that, for example, in 1994, when he was the spokesman on Home Affairs, he spoke in the debate on gay rights that I initiated, and which changed the law for gay men, the age of consent, from 21 actually down to 18. We did try to get it to equality, just lost, but we got it to 18. The first time it had been debated in the House of Commons for a quarter of a century, to my astonishment. And Tony Blair spoke extremely well. And he was clearly a moderniser and clearly very comfortable with the shifts and changes in attitudes that I wanted to see in British society and that some of my Tory colleagues did not want to see. And I remember noting in my diary, if he carries on like that, he'd be Prime Minister someday. We didn't think it would happen that soon, but of course, within months, John Smith had died and Blair had been elected the leader. Now, what he was quite brilliant at was winning elections. Putting forward an image, a headline, a message, a soundbite that was exactly what people wanted to hear. It was several elections before it began to dawn on voters that he wasn't actually delivering that at all. And that if you compared what he was doing, it was rather different. And all this stuff about the people's this, the people's that, people's princess and so on. Actually what he was doing was leading us to war behind the Americans. And it got to the stage where the United Kingdom was embroiled in two different wars, neither of which we could win, at an enormous cost in lives. Our soldiers, civilians in the countries concerned, and money, of course. And it began to fall apart.
Back to when he did win that election, though, in 97, I think you wrote in your diaries, I don't know, perhaps jokingly, I'm not sure, that you were thrilled to bits that he got into power.
Like a lot of people, bear in mind that in 1997 he had the most immense landslide. I mean, the Tories were reduced to far fewer seats than Neil Kinnock had in Margaret's ascendancy. And the feeling was that it was a decisive moment when the British people had said, look, we don't hate gays. We don't hate immigrants. We don't hate young people. We are gay, immigrant, young people. We are a much more inclusive society. I think in some ways the culmination of that, if you like, has been the recent Olympics, where we've had a celebration of a completely different new generation who have been so successful. People with diverse backgrounds, disabled people, so on. Absolutely, I'm thrilled to bits. I love this, absolutely love it. They weren't the good old days, they were the bad old days. Anyone who's been part of a minority, anyone who was a woman, would recognise that. So, Blair offered a different vision to the British people, and they bought into it big time. Had he continued in that way, had he delivered that, then I think we'd probably still be Prime Minister. But he didn't. It was all hot air. He had accurately worked out what wins elections, but then actually what goes on winning elections, you have to deliver. And neither he nor Gordon Brown were ever able to do that.
Who changed the country the most for you then? Never mind positively or negatively, Thatcher, Major or Blair?
I think Margaret Thatcher changed the country most because she demonstrated a resolve that had been missing from several previous Prime Ministers, both Tory and Labour, in that she faced down the unions. And I was in the thick of that fight because I had a coal mining constituency where the miners took a vote and voted not to strike. They became one of the core elements of the Union of Democratic Mine Workers. Even while they were saying to me, we're digging dirt down there, these pits are going to close, and we know that. And your job, Mrs. Currie, is to find us something else to do. And in that sense, Margaret shifted attitudes to economic reality. And I don't think they've shifted that much since. Take something like the firemen's strike that's been going on recently. What are the firemen striking about? Oh my God, they're going to be made to work till 60. And they're going to have to pay more for their pensions. And you can hear large numbers of the public saying, quite right too, we have to, so should they. So she shifted attitudes in that respect far more. She did things. She said she was going to do it, and she did it. Brilliant.
Moving on sort of to the more recent history in politics, if Labour was really sort of the cause of all our ills in the last Parliament, why didn't the electorate vote for overwhelmingly a Conservative majority government in 2010?
Well, bear in mind that the Tories started off from quite a low base and won 100 seats, which is more than Margaret ever won in any of her elections. And Labour comprehensively lost roughly 100 seats. Lib Dems were about the same as they'd had before. So had the Tories started off from a slightly higher level of seats and perhaps a more normal opposition level, they'd have won it hands down. No argument about that. I don't think any more could have been done, to be honest. And there's also, when you've had that kind of, the long love affair that the public had with Tony Blair and with New Labour, letting go and moving on to something different, which is unknown, is very difficult. Incumbents in seats always have a very big edge. I think the expenses scandal was what did for Labour, and the feeling that they had, too many of the people in Parliament at that time had put money ahead of public service. So David Cameron's approach was much more astringent, if you like, much cleaner and fresher. Whether they've done enough to win the next election, we shall see. I think so. You get coalitions in Britain at time of national crisis. It's usually wartime. But in 2010, there was a national crisis. We had an immense deficit in countries like Greece and Italy and Spain and Portugal, where the deficits were huge, in Ireland as well. Economies had collapsed. There were riots on the streets of Greece, even as the coalition tried to put its package together. So we had a crisis, and that's why a coalition was put together, with, I think, immense courage on the part of the senior participants, David Cameron and Nick Clegg. When the crisis passes, coalitions then dissolve. I don't think, since we're still running deficits to the tune of £10 billion a month, I don't think the crisis has passed yet.
No, and that's what lots of political commentators, I think, believe, that there will perhaps be yet another coalition come 2015. It's a long way away, of course, but the election, but they think that maybe the Tories will have to start planning for that, and Labour maybe as well, with some sort of bond with the Lib Dems.
You can be pretty sure that I think this time there's planning going on for possible coalitions. One of the reasons I have never voted Lib Dem is that I'm quite sure that they're planning to go with both sides, and that they will say different things to both sides. You know, arguing with a Lib Dem is like trying to nail jelly to the ceiling. I would rather be with a party that knows what it wants and knows how to get it. In many ways, I respect old Labour, the old socialists, the people I knew when I was a youngster, people who believe in socialism and so on. I don't agree with them, and I don't think it works. Nonetheless, I recognise that they believe that they've found a way to make our country a fair place. I actually believe you have to make the country a prosperous place first, and then you've got something to distribute, and that has been the history of our nation for 200 years. So I've always liked to be a Tory. That doesn't mean to say I buy every bit of it, but I'm instinctively in favour of enterprise, initiative, encouragement of the best, setting high standards, saying well done, letting people earn their money and keep most of it so that taxation ceases to be the problem that it has been, the burden it has been over recent decades.
On that note of the Liberal Democrats, I think Vince Cable earlier this year described them, well, just at their latest party conference, described them as a left-wing party. But of course, you know, they're in government now with the Conservatives. Do you think that was the right move for David Cameron? Perhaps it was his only option, but do you think it's worked out?
The coalition was the only option. We had to have a government, and the only numbers that worked were for the Tories and the Lib Dems to go together. Any alternative would have depended on individuals like Caroline Lucas and odds and sods of various kinds from Northern Ireland. Previous experience, if you've seen the National Theatre play This House, you'll know what I'm talking about. The previous experience on the Labour side of trying to put together a coalition when you don't actually have the numbers, you are then doing stupid deals in order to get one person to come and vote on one issue. That's not government. At the time, with so many problems in our business partners in Europe and America as well, we needed a stable government with a big majority that could get difficult issues through. My main regret is that we really didn't properly tackle the issue of benefits. We tended, both with the NHS and with benefits, what the coalition have done is complicated reforms that took a long time to go through Parliament and that will have a long time to have an effect, and indeed may not have the effects promised. What would have been better would have been to simplify the system for benefits, far fewer benefits and at a lower level, and just be quite firm about that. If, for example, we had said right at the beginning, all benefits would be cut by 10%, that would have taken 20 billion out of the budget immediately. And we could then have said, hard, tough, we're all in it together.
You've claimed...
But we didn't do that.
Yeah, well, you've claimed earlier this year, I think, that you can live on £53 a week.
No, I didn't.
You didn't say that?
No. A man phoned up Radio 5 and said, how would you like to live on what I've got? I've only got £53 a week. And I immediately got into, do you have housing benefit? Is your council tax paid? A whole host of things. It turned out that he was actually living on £150 a week, and that he was also a market trader, some of which I suspect he might not have declared. I don't know. But he was talking about cash in hand. Well, cash in hand, if you've paid all your housing costs, is and all your taxes have been paid and everything else, that's actually your cash in hand. For a single person, might well be a reasonable amount. There is also an issue, is there not, of how much can the country afford to pay people to do nothing, to live in accommodation that may be too big for them, where those on benefits are better off than those who are not on benefits. That's nuts. That's absolutely nuts. It means that people then take a perfectly rational decision to stay on benefits instead of going into work. And that means we're subsidising people to be dependent. The individuals are making a rational decision. It's a rational economic decision, not to disadvantage your family.
Of course, that's just a small example, proportion of the people who are actually...
I think that's a substantial proportion. If you are, if you're in a situation where you earn less, taking into account paying tax, your travel costs, your clothing costs for work, food for your children and all the rest of it, for many people, if they do the sums, they're better off on benefits. And that's not them being in any way reprehensible. That's them being rational. And it's up to society as a whole to do something.
You don't condemn it. You respect it if it's a rational decision, do you? You're quite...
I would always say to somebody in that situation, listen, you may be starting in work at the bottom of the ladder, but there's a ladder.
Okay.
And it's then up to you to get yourself in a situation, and you may well do that quite quickly, where you are better off in work. It behooves government to cut taxes on employment, which in fact the coalition has done, so that you keep most of what you earn, but also to change the benefits level so it's no longer a better option. And to be quite firm about that. and to make it quite clear that there ain't going to be any change back. So, you know, if you're struggling on benefits, there are jobs. We have sucked into this country hundreds of thousands, millions of people from overseas. People like my grandparents who came from Eastern Europe. People come 1,000 miles or more to do the jobs in Britain that other people won't do or can't afford to do. And somewhere along the line, that's a daft way of running a country. So I think that one of the keys to it is reduce the benefits level, reduce the taxes on employment, all the taxes on employment, and encourage people to get the jobs that do exist. And that way there won't be a job for a nice lady from Poland to do when she arrives. Realistically,
though, will there be a Conservative government, or indeed any government, that puts those policies you've just suggested into practice?
Well, this government has passed legislation for universal credit, and it's supposed to work the way I've just described. But anything complicated never works. You know, a bicycle works the way it's described. A Porsche Carrera 911 is a very complicated machine and needs a lot of skill driving. So I prefer simple systems. And we have to hope that, in fact, universal credit proves me wrong and does exactly the job that's on the can. We shall see.
On a different note, I think you've been labelled throughout your career as talented, brave and thoughtful, I've got written down here, and also repugnant, vile and heartless, after you tweeted that the late cricketer Tom Maynard's death was Darwinism at work. So do you like being controversial? I wasn't too sure who Tom Maynard was, and I apologised afterwards. But in terms of controversy, do you enjoy that, or do you think maybe taking a back seat is better? Part of politics is explaining what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it. And it needs to be done in as clear language as possible. You're talking to millions of people, diverse backgrounds, all sorts of attitudes and so on. If they hear you explain what you're trying to do, first of all, they actually appreciate you trying to explain it. And secondly, they may understand that much better. And thirdly, they might actually agree. And if they're arguing about it over the kitchen table or arguing about it while they're watching the telly, that's a good thing. That's such a good thing. And I'm more than happy to do that. So I tweet, for example, quite a lot. But I only tweet when I've got something to say, when I'm prepared to get engaged in debate. Debate then shows you where the weaknesses in your argument are. Make you think about it, make you come up with better information. We live in a democracy, and democracy depends on informed consent. To me, that's magic. I wouldn't want to live in any other kind of country. And finally, we are here in Manchester for the Conservative Party Conference 2013. Is there anything that you disagree with fundamentally that this current Tory-led government are doing or have done in office? Do I disagree with anything fundamentally? I just like them to get a move on. My biggest anxiety, having taught economics, is that we haven't got that deficit down. It should be a lot smaller than it is still, 10 billion, 11 billion a month. And that when interest rates do eventually start going up, as they're bound to, that is going to be the cost of servicing the debt alone is going to be the biggest budget. That's not where you want to be. It's a bit like having an immense Barclay card with a huge interest rate on it, where you're paying interest on the interest on the interest. I don't want that to be the case. I would rather we get to a balanced budget as soon as possible. That's the only thing I would push the coalition to do faster. But what about the married couples tax break proposed by David Cameron? Your daughter, I think, is a defiant advocate for becoming a single mother deliberately. And of course she wouldn't then qualify for this benefit. My daughter is a law unto herself. She will be 39 very shortly, and we often amicably disagree about all sorts of things. And this is one of those issues. Well, the thing about the married person's tax break is that it generates a lot of debate, and that's good. Back when the rules changed about the MIRAS, the mortgage interest relief, this is now back to 1988.
Until that point, a married woman couldn't submit her own tax return, had to be done as part of her husband's. And then it was decided you could have independent tax returns, and therefore you could then both claim the tax allowance for a mortgage. At that point, a whole host of people that I know, including members of the family, decide not to get married. 25 years later, they're still together, but they're still not married. Now, those are good people I'm talking about. Many others have found it much harder, and the pattern in society changed dramatically with couples not staying together. There is absolutely no doubt that a child that's brought up in a shifting community of parents, step-parents and so on does far less well than one that's brought up in a stable environment. If governments can take some steps to encourage stability to return, that's got to be a good thing. If that means upsetting some of the people that think they lead a better lifestyle, well, we shall see. But I have a feeling that behaviour might actually change. One of the nice things about it, however, is you don't have to have children to qualify, and you don't have to be heterosexual, which I think is brilliant.
Edwina Currie, thank you. Cheers. Thank you very much.